Okay, hello, welcome everyone to this third webinar in our Municipal Court webinar series. My name is Lindsay Price Jackson from the Center for Justice Innovation. I'm joined by some really awesome panelists today, so stay tuned for that. So glad that everyone could be here. I'm just here at the top of our webinar to give a little announcement that as part of this amazing webinar series, this project is really going to be culminating in an in-person convening about municipal courts. And that will take place, mark your calendars, on October 23rd and 24th. That's a Thursday and a Friday. And this will be in Newark, New Jersey at the Rutgers School of Criminal Justice. It will be free to attend. There's no registration fee. So if this seems like something you'd be interested in, to attend our day and a half convening all on municipal courts and what comes next. What can we do about all this that we've learned and how can we keep moving the field forward? Please consider that. Starting next month at our fourth webinar, we're going to be having a survey for participants to see what kind of content you'd be interested in and to get some ideas from you on who might be the people you want to hear from most at that convening, and maybe what are the data findings that you want to talk more about and really troubleshoot and brainstorm about. So keep that in mind. I'm also going to plug that we, like in all of our webinars, are putting in the chat our experiential survey. I think it's in the chat now. And so this is for everyone with any kind of experience in municipal court, whether you have been a case participant, the defendant, right, even a victim, or an attorney, a judge, case manager, just to share some of your experiences, positive, negative, otherwise, what are some exciting trends you're seeing in municipal courts? And this will really help inform our project and our next two webinars talking more about best practices and innovative work that is being done in municipal courts. So with that, I'll turn it over to our facilitator, Lauren. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about our discussion and the terrific panel that we have to join us. I'll be introducing them shortly. My name is Lauren Studial. I'm on the faculty at Vanderbilt Law School. And the original title that our webinar was given for today was Municipal Courts as Potential Sites of Racial and Socioeconomic Disparity. I'll obviously be touching on that in this really brief introduction, but we added a subtitle in part because as a panel, we really want to take this time to not just highlight potential problems, but also lift up the positive work that courts are doing to identify and address disparities within their own systems and emphasize opportunities that exist for intervention and progress. Next slide. As has already been touched on in other webinars in the series, if you've been fortunate to join, municipal courts are a regular part of so many people's daily lives. In many ways, we might think of them as at the bottom of the justice pyramid, not in terms of their importance, but in terms of their proximity to the people. However, as a result, that's also why socioeconomic and racial disparities are likely to show up here first. I think this quote sort of encompasses that idea well from the Salt Lake City Justice Court, saying, "We are painfully aware that municipal courts like ours have historically been situated on, or at least very near, the tip of systemic racism's spear." So what are these disparities? Next slide. Part of the issue is it's not totally clear. One of the problems with the way in which we've collected and can see data is that we don't have a really good picture of the national scene, right? We have little to no national municipal court data about the overall demographics of people who appear in municipal court, the number of people who don't have a lawyer, the dispositions or outcomes in these cases. And where data does exist, of course, individual courts might collect and analyze this data, but it's typically done on a case by or jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, making it difficult to obtain a broader systemic picture. In 2020, the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators released a report noting that without collecting, reporting, and maintaining court data on issues like race and ethnicity, it can obviously be impossible to identify actual disparities. And the National Center for State Courts has emphasized that tracking such data helps not only to identify areas of disparate impact and disparate treatment, but also where marginalized groups are experiencing more negative outcomes, courts can use that data to make informed decisions about how to improve delivery of court services and measure that improvement, demonstrating positive impact over time. Next slide. Of course, and we've talked about this some, and I know it will come up again later in the presentation, There are certainly municipal court practices, including the imposition of fines and fees, that can disproportionately impact certain populations. And I know that one of our panelists will be touching on that. But I think it's also worth noting that other seemingly harmless policies, like advances in technology, can also have disproportionate impacts based on race or wealth. For example, if a court requires electronic filing of documents in all debt claims cases, and Black or poor communities within that jurisdiction are less likely than others to have access to broadband services, defendants from those communities may be less likely to respond to cases filed against them. Developing alternative approaches, in this case, perhaps providing access to the electronic filing platform at a public library, or providing alternatives to electronic filing, not only level the playing field for those who've been systematically disadvantaged, but also likely provide needed assistance across the board. Next slide. While we don't have a national picture of the disparities in municipal courts, studies that have delved deeper into specific jurisdictions have sometimes revealed a troubling picture. For example, a study of South Carolina's magistrate and municipal courts in 2016-2017 revealed not only stark racial disparities between court personnel and the people being prosecuted, but also insufficient rights advisement and a strong likelihood of rights deprivation for socioeconomically disadvantaged defendants. While these issues are by no means unique to municipal courts, they may be more likely where legal representation is so rare. Next slide. Last, disparities exist not only in how people are treated by the courts, but how they perceive courts. The National Center for State Courts has emphasized that collecting and tracking demographic data can be helpful in this respect. Such data help communicate to the public and to people using the courts that the courts are providing equal justice in a fair and transparent way, and that people are being well served across groups, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or class. And the slides can go away. I know that introduction was fairly brief and obviously at a very high level, but I think the real substance and excitement of our panel today is our panelists, who I'll now introduce, who will really be enriching our discussion with many more specifics of their work on the ground. So first we have Dylan Hare. Dylan is the National Advocacy and Campaigns Director at the Fines and Fees Justice Center. After starting his career as a prosecutor in his home state of Massachusetts, Dylan went on to support several political and issue organizing efforts focusing primarily on justice reform. He has since worked at Just Leadership USA, the ACLU, and Arnold Ventures before joining the team at FFJC. Next, we have Rochelle Pride, who's the Interim Director of Economic Development and Planning and the Director of the Office of Justice Policy and Programs and the Court-Appointed Special Advocates in Franklin County, Ohio. Rochelle is a transformational servant leader with almost 2 decades of expertise in social and criminal justice, youth services, consultancy, and leadership. She has provided her expertise to a wide range of national, state, and local groups to support justice-related projects with an emphasis on racial inequity, community health, and economic mobility. Over the years, Rochelle has been instrumental in piloting several initiatives, one currently recognized as a specialty docket by the Supreme Court of Ohio. And last but not least, we have Jonathan Puente, who's the director of the Utah Judiciary's Office of Fairness and Accountability. Jonathan is a native of Chicago and received his JD from Loyola University Chicago School of Law. For the last 11 years, he has been working in equity and inclusion initiatives at all stages: policy development and implementation, strategic planning, and community outreach. During the last 7 years, his focus has been on diversifying the legal profession, the bench, and increasing access to justice to marginalized communities. He is the inaugural director of the Office of Fairness and Accountability at the AOC, which is tasked with identifying and removing racism and bias from the Utah courts. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. And just to give the audience a brief sense of our agenda for today, I'm going to first turn it over to Jonathan and then Rochelle to tell us about some of the great work that they and their courts are doing in Utah and Ohio. Dylan Hare will then share the perspective of those at the Fines and Fees Justice Center and also talk about the importance of and how to center impacted people in this work. We'll then have some time for the panelists to engage in dialogue with each other, and last, open it up for Q&A. On that note, I want to just instruct the audience that if you have questions that come up, please post them in the Q&A field on Zoom. And if able, I'll try to incorporate some of these into our discussion, and hopefully we'll have some time just to address questions at the end. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Lauren. Great to be here. I'm really excited to be presenting about this and be with this group and talking about these really important issues. A couple of things I wanted to mention and doing and guiding this work. This work in Utah, began in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd. Our judicial council felt that, as many jurisdictions where were releasing statements. They felt they needed to do more, so they started this office. What guides our office is it's a rule establishing this work, which stipulates that the OFA, the Office of Fairness and Accountability, is organized to lead the judicial branch in examining and addressing processes and outcomes within the judicial branch that contribute to our cause of equal treatment of individuals. So that's our North, this rule is our North Star, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that folks are treated fairly and with respect, regardless of factors such as race, gender, ethnicity, disability, and economic status, like religion, sexual orientation, or marital status, veteran status. Again, we want to make sure that everyone is treated fairly and with respect when they come to the courts. Now, one of the things that we saw, and the Utah courts have known about this for about 20 years, because 20 some years ago they had a task force looking to address these same issues. And one of the things that the task force noticed or found was the disproportionately overrepresentation of communities of color in the criminal adjudication process. They turned in their report. Sadly, nothing was done with that report. It was shelved. So one of the things that we wanted to do was to continue with what that commission found, and addressing that issue of racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal adjudication process here in the state of Utah. So we recognize that was the problem. I'll give you one data point, or a couple of data points. For example, the Black population in the state of Utah is like 1.8%. However, in our jails and prisons, that percentage point jumps to 8%. Latinos, and in the state it's about 20% of the population. However, in jails and prisons, our representation is about 35%. So there's a significant disparity. So we knew that there were significant issues. Now, one of the things that was a barrier for us in addressing this issue was our lack of demographic data. So one of the things that we are currently doing is looking to address this problem with the aid of researchers. What we're going to do is we are sending our cases to these researchers, who are going to then, in partnership with the U.S. Census Bureau, do a one-to-one matching. That way we know who is who in our system. And once we know that, we can then see, by controlling for confounding factors and do a true apples to apples measurement, and see what do we do that causes this racial and ethnic disparities. So to guide this project, we formed a work group to identify items or cases within our justice courts. That's what we call our municipal courts here in the state of Utah. Within our justice courts, that may create this these disparities. So we identify certain case types, from driving without a license to driving without proof of insurance, driving under the influence, trespass, possession of controlled substance. And once we identify those cases, what we then want to do is measure the following: charging decisions, pretrial release decisions, plea bargaining by prosecution, sentencing decisions, and recommendations from probation. Again, we want to really measure what, as much as possible, what causes those disparities. Now, once we identify these, again, we'll through our partnership with our research partners, and we get those results back. We want to make sure that this is more than just a research project. Once we get those results back, then what we want to do is create policy to address these decisions. Again, as was mentioned, we recognize here in Utah that the justice courts or municipal courts, they are, you know, the start or the part of the judicial branch that the public has most contact with. So we want to address these issues because without addressing these issues, we really impact our trust and confidence with the public. And without that public trust and confidence, we lose legitimacy. So when we don't address these issues, we recognize that that impression of bias lingers. Even though we can do as much trainings with our staff, we can try to recruit a diverse staff, but if that impression of mistrust and bias lingers with the public, a lot of our efforts are for naught. So we want to address these issues, and part of this also is we are engaging in significant community outreach to work with these communities, to hear them out, to hear their concerns, and try to address those concerns as much as possible. Now, to really make sure that we are covering and addressing as many of our gaps as possible, we're developing a strategic plan with 3 areas of focus in mind. 1, public trust and confidence. 2nd, increasing access to justice. And 3rd, ensuring constitutional openness. By that, I mean, we want to make sure that we address any racial and ethnic socioeconomic disparity within the court system. So again, we really are intentional about addressing these sorts of issues, because this is a where I feel we're in the middle of this national crisis of both of access to justice and in trust and confidence in the judiciary. So if we are not intentional, the winds of mistrust will blow us into a place where we might not necessarily want to be. So we're leading out these efforts to really engage the community, build trust, and make sure that our judicial decision making is free of bias, and folks are treated with fairness and respect here in the courts.
Thanks, Jonathan. Rochelle?
Thank you so much, Lauren. Hello, everyone, and thank you again for the opportunity to present here today. I'm very excited about this discussion because anytime that we create a space to really talk about what's happening around us and those who are impacted by the things that have taken place around us, we create an opportunity for change. And all those changes have been certainly a challenge. We know that with collaboration and through collective impact, we can continue to move the needle forward. Again, my name is Rochelle Pride, and I have the pleasure of serving as director for our Economic Development and Planning Agency, interim, as well as our Office of Justice Policy and Programs. And I want to take you back kind of on of where this all began. Franklin County has been very intentional in our work for now over the past decade in addressing a lot of the racial and socioeconomic disparities that we know individuals who encounter the justice system face. But I would go further enough to say that we were probably a decade too late. We understand that there are intergenerational impacts when we know that disproportionate minority contact becomes a real thing over and over again within our systems. And so here in Franklin County, first of all, the establishment of our Office of Justice Policy and Programs, was a step forward, and how our Board of Commissioners, who we serve at the pleasure of, as well as our county leadership, said we are going to be intentional, we are going to be targeted, and we're going to be consistent in the move and the changes we want to make. And so our office is challenged with ensuring that we have a collective impact approach to our system-wide comprehensive justice planning for Franklin County. So we do everything from training, offering technical assistance, looking at data, research, making sure that we are using that to inform our decision-making. We also are a fiduciary agent. So we allocate a lot of the federal, state, and local dollars to our justice ecosystem, as well as our community partners, to ensure that there is fidelity in the work, and that we are close enough to that fidelity to ensure that based on the data, based on the research, based on the planning, we know where the dollars are going and how they are being utilized. We do, of course, work with all of our criminal justice planning board partners, our reentry advisory board partners, which is a makeup of our elected and appointed officials, as well as community partners and those with lived experiences here in Franklin County. And so we get to do this work with everyone that I named, in addition to our court-appointed special advocates, who are our staff attorneys that go way upstream to interrupt and advocate for those young people in our communities who have been identified as abused, neglected, and dependent. The reason that that is important to us as we have this conversation about what is happening further downstream is that if we understand what the data tells us about young people who are impacted by the child welfare system, who are identified as abused, neglected, or dependent, we understand that there's a trajectory of predictive analytics that places those young people inevitably into our juvenile justice system and then into our adult system if said interventions are not done and or preventative measures have not taken place. And so what we work for here in Franklin County is to see what we call from reentry to no entry into our systems, the prevention that needs to be in practice of the work we do every day, because that's exactly what we should be doing each and every day. We do this work through a lot of human-centered design and targeted universalistic approaches, but most importantly, it's based on what our community, our residents who have been impacted by various systems, who have unfortunately dealt with the oppression versus the progression in their lives because of systematic barriers and the understanding the nuances that causes them in the impact of their day-to-day life. And so what we did in 2019, our Franklin County Board of Commissioners came together to release our Rise Together Blueprint for reducing poverty and disparities in Franklin County. Now, how did that transition into what you see happening within our courts? This was a collective approach that we brought, not just the community, as we, again, label this as our people's plan, because our people is who sat down with us to steer this ship of change, understanding what our assessments were, understanding what they understood about their own situations. And we worked with our Kerwin Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at The Ohio State University to really quantify this information. We looked at those data points that told us that here in Franklin County overall, our incarceration rates were 223 by 100,000 for the overall demographic. But we knew that for African Americans and folks of colors, it was upwards of 637 per 100,000 that were seeing the impact of incarceration. And so what our teams continue to do was look at this landscape and figure out how do we move the needle forward. And we began to do what was the launch of Stepping Towards Justice. We worked to really identify, especially at the height and in the midst of the pandemic, a framework that helped us, one, acknowledge that racism is a root cause of poverty, bad health, broken families, and damaged communities, and that we understood that this also leads to over-incarceration and those individuals who, of course, are impacted by being underserved. We looked at why is there racial disparities in persons who commit and are charged with offenses of this type. We looked at how are these decisions being made by our justice authorities, from law enforcement to prosecution to court probation. And at each of these intercepts, we really wanted to understand what exactly is happening. So in about 2018, our courts members of our Criminal Justice Planning Board participated in what was called a sequential intercept mapping, where we literally looked at each sector and each system to understand what was happening in their decision-making process based on the data and based on what we understood to be true about that data. We did a lot of mining of this information, looking at length of stay and case processing, racial inequities in arrest, probation tech violations, our bond trends, and our likelihood for arrest and population and demographic density. So what we were able to do with this information was then began to spearhead how do we decarcerate our local jail facility, and what was the data telling us based on what our jails were seeing on the back end, right? Understanding that when the decision is made in court and a person is put into a position of incarceration, we know that then there begins a whole different path that has to be mapped out and that has to be understood. So our municipal court actually during the pandemic assisted our county in literally flipping the face of our jail. The profile of our jail completely changed to where we were able to look at cases very intentionally and understand that those who were in jail that did not need to be there, or cases could be handled in an alternative manner, needed the access to be able to do so. We realized that following that initiative and following some of the grunt work that our municipal courts did, we looked at our jail population based on race. In 2023, about 62% of the individuals that were in our county jail were African American. We looked at by gender, right? We understood that the demographic of men versus women who were in our jail in 2023 were 87%. And so all of this came together to help us really begin to go into a lot of the different initiatives that we're going to highlight here today. But I just wanted to make sure that there was an understanding. Of course, everything starts somewhere, and that is where a legacy is developed. And so through the identifying of the problem and looking at the challenges, we were able to then move forward with solutions that were going to impact our community in a different way. And we got to do that by looking at it from the lens of those who are in the shoes, experiencing this, and those that we, of course, understood they were the subject matter experts. It was incumbent upon us to realize that. It was incumbent upon us to understand that those individuals were the true storytellers. They were the qualitative data that sometimes even mattered more than the numbers, and how we address those disparities.
Thanks, Rochelle. Dylan?
Okay, just gonna share some slides. Can folks see the slides here? Perfect. Oops. All right. Well, thank you, Lauren, Jonathan, and Rochelle. I am going to step back and try to offer some thoughts on the challenges and opportunities that municipal courts can present for our work as advocates in the fine and fee reform movement. And I'll start with a basic question. What happens when court prioritizes revenue over justice? I think for millions of people across the country, this isn't a hypothetical thought exercise. It's not even really a question. It's a statement of their day-to-day reality. Revenue over justice is not an abstract idea. It's the experience that real people are having, and that's inflicting real harm on their lives. And to better understand the breadth of this problem and why there is such an unyielding urgency for reform, I'd like to take us back to 2015. 10 years ago, in what's commonly known as the Ferguson Report, the Department of Justice wrote this: the Ferguson Municipal Court handles most charges brought by the Ferguson Police Department and does so not with the primary goal of administering justice or protecting the rights of the accused, but of maximizing revenue. Many of you probably remember the events that led to this report. An 18-year-old Black man named Michael Brown was murdered by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson. Michael's death sparked a resurgence in community organizing around issues of police violence, racial injustice, and the criminal legal system's role in each of those things. A few months after that, in March 2015, the DOJ released their report, Investigation of the Ferguson Police Department. And that report chronicled in damning detail how Ferguson relied on policing and their municipal courts to generate revenue, how that reliance led to the total erosion of trust between police, courts, and people, how that erosion was characterized by glaring and ubiquitous racial discrimination, and how that discrimination came to define what the criminal legal system represented. There are two reasons to go back to this report. First, as groundbreaking as it was, for Black people who lived in Ferguson, the report wasn't anything new. It reaffirmed what they had been experiencing and talking about for years. But this report helped bring their voices and their pain to the forefront of our national conscience. This report was in many ways the genesis of a national fine and fee reform movement. And the second reason to revisit this report, Ferguson was not and is not unique. Municipal courts exist across the country. For millions of people, a local municipal court is their only place to seek justice, and it's the institution communities are forced to trust to administer justice fairly. But in many jurisdictions, municipal courts serve one purpose above all else. It's not to resolve harm or to put people on a path toward healing and redemption. Regardless of stated purpose or the best intent of people who work in those courts, the practical reality is often this. Municipal court's job is to generate revenue for local government, even if it feels like you're solving local problems with the local court. The perverse systemic incentives around revenue force courts to extract resources from people to compensate local government for the budget holes they're not willing to fill in other ways. In other words, even if revenue generation is viewed or felt by some as a consequence of more justice-focused processes, the problems arise when that consequence becomes the most essential function. But even while municipal courts try to serve that function, so few of them actually keep data on the efficacy or, as importantly, the larger impact of what they're doing. Who's being assessed fines and fees? What are the considerations going into those assessments? What are the demographics and disparities in assessment, enforcement, and collection? How much is being collected? Where is it going? These are just some of the questions that advocates and policymakers need to understand. And as you heard from Jonathan and Rochelle, these are the questions that some courts have tried to answer. At the Fines and Fees Justice Center, our mission is clear. We're fighting every single day to ensure that fines are equitably and fairly imposed, to eliminate fees, and to end onerous collections practices. Our advocacy toward achieving those goals lives in two national campaigns. Free to Drive, which is focused on ending license restrictions stemming from court debt, and End Justice Fees, which is focused on ending all fees in the criminal legal system. Municipal courts are far too often moving us in the wrong direction. When revenue is the goal, fines are levied with an eye toward maximizing revenue, not maximizing justice and equity. Fees are prolific and can compound quickly. Police are turned into armed debt collectors, and courts use tools like suspending someone's license to punish them because they cannot afford to pay fines and fees, or to somehow coerce payment from them even though they can't afford it. And when you can't actually see the data of what's happening, it becomes impossible to try to solve any of these problems. So in other words, when you're looking at the broad landscape of municipal courts, I think the bottom line for a lot of advocates is this: the challenges presented by municipal courts and their role as revenue generators for local government stand between us and our goals in states across the country. There are some other problems too, stemming from the prioritization of revenue. Municipal courts effectively fracture a criminal legal system into hundreds or thousands of smaller systems. For many people, how you experience the law depends less on the law itself and depends instead on how your local court interprets and applies that law. Additionally, they incentivize net widening. If they're seen as generating needed revenue through the proliferation of fines, fees, and debt-based consequences and arrests, well, when you need more revenue, what else do you think you're going to get more of? Still, we've just heard some amazing examples of how folks can begin remedying or at least understanding some of these problems. And I think one thing we can all agree on, municipal court reforms, really any community-based reform, have to be designed, refined, enacted, and implemented in authentic working partnership with directly impacted community members. You have to empower directly impacted communities to lead reforms. And from the perspective of the community-centered advocacy that defines our work, I'll offer 3 ideas that I think can help initiate or strengthen those partnerships. First is humanize the problem. Revenue is a pretty technical term. At the very least, it's a system-centric term. It's about what's coming into the state. But let's think about what's going out of people's lives, because here's what's really happening. If you're trapped in a cycle of debt in your municipal court, you can't buy groceries for your kids because you owe thousands of dollars in fines. You can't afford rent this month because you have to pay fees or face the risk of having a warrant issue for your arrest and police knock down your door. You can't call police when you're the victim of harm because you know you owe fines or fees, and it's more likely they come to collect from you instead of check on you. In other words, it's important to recognize and attempt to put into real-world terms the resources that a municipal court might be extracting from the community. Secondly, acknowledge the cultural impact. It's one thing to walk into court knowing that your economic standing could be a greater determinant of outcomes than your guilt or innocence. It's another to understand the impact that has on people's day-to-day lives. Go back to Ferguson or ask anyone who's in a community that's been subject to revenue generation through financial exploitation. It erodes trust in courts. It erodes trust in police. It is corrosive to the trust people have in local systems broadly. It makes justice feel farther away than it already does, and it already feels really far away for a lot of Black and brown people across the country. So know that even if you attempt to drive change in or through your municipal court, there's a larger cultural dynamic that also has to be addressed. And then 3, put revenue where it matters. I can tell you from some of the prior work I've done, nothing matters more than community voice when you're trying to figure out what revenue is needed and where. I'm not naive to the fact that slashing whatever revenue a municipal court may generate could lead to some difficult decisions about your budget. Make those decisions in partnership with the people whose lives have been shaped by that municipal court. Understand your budget, not in terms of a preconceived sense of need, but in terms of a collaboratively developed sense of purpose. And finally, I'll end on this. To the extent that municipal courts continue to exist and remain generally independent of larger systems or even one another, if you are able to drive change in your local municipal court, some of the changes you can think about. Stop suspending people's licenses when they're not able to pay fine or fee debt. Forgive outstanding debt that may have accrued, and stop imposing fees. I'll just conclude on this. I know none of this is easy. None of it's going to happen overnight. But I hope that what folks are taking from this webinar is that there are definitely real problems. There are also possible solutions. And there are some really, really incredible people who want to work on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan, and thank you also, Rochelle and Jonathan. So I'm just going to jump right into discussion, and in doing so, try to incorporate at least one question that we've gotten so far. Some of the questions I have, I think, will be a little bit more about getting into the details of what you all are doing in Utah and Ohio. But I want to start with, I guess, a bigger question prompted by one of our audience members, which relates to questions about abolition and decriminalization, right? So we've heard about some really positive, proactive things being done in the courts to address, right, what may be some current disparities. And we've also heard Dylan talk about sort of how revenue generation is intimately tied up with a lot of what municipal courts do. So given that, I guess the question from our audience member is anyone working on, or what do you think of the argument that we should actually just shrink the footprint of these courts, right, in addition to trying to improve what they do, perhaps in part because they are inherently tied up with, right, mass criminalization and these inequities? So with that, I guess maybe I'll toss it to you, Jonathan, to start, and then other panelists can chime in.
So the state of Utah, because the municipal courts or justice courts were not courts of record, if there were any cases that a party wanted to appeal, they had to start the process from scratch again in the district courts, which was incredibly expensive because they went through it once and now they had to go through it again. So adding to what Dylan was saying, like, some communities felt this significantly more than other communities. So the last couple of years, we were in the middle of justice court reform, where we were going to do away with justice courts and come up with a different model where it would all be, instead of being those case types and those offenses were going to be managed by municipality courts. They were going to be managed by the judiciary, by the judicial branch of Utah. However, we ended up in a very difficult relationship with the legislature the last two legislative sessions, and any support towards the judiciary sort of went away. So that project was pretty much stopped. But we were in the process of doing that because a lot of what Dylan was saying, but also because of the cost of folks that wanted to have any case appealed. But yeah, we're not the only state where the judiciary and the legislature are kind of in an unfriendly relationship at the moment, and that's what sort of sank that initiative. But we were right in the middle of doing that when when the legislative session happened.
I will say that. Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan.
No, so if I actually want to ask the other panelists this question. We're in a very red state, and we this last 2 or 3 legislative sessions passed significant anti-DEI bills where we kind of sort of were not as impacted because of separation of powers, where my office still was able to keep functioning. However, we don't function in a silo. And we know that we inherit a lot of problems upstream from other agencies. And they were not exempt from those bills. So like law enforcement, Department of Workforce Services, like they no longer can do any of this work by state law. So a lot of what we are doing now is just kind of within the judicial branch, but we recognize we inherit, we get all this upstream issues from them. So we're in the middle of navigating that. So my question to my fellow panelists is, are you seeing this? And if so, how are you managing this? Because I'm also came here looking for help on this. So like, yeah, if you can tell me how you're maneuvering this, because we are like, we're leaning in. We recognize we have to solve these issues of disparities, but we're probably in one of the most toxic environments nationally that I've seen in my 45 years of life. And so any help you can, or that you can give me right now, that would be great.
I will say, John, and thank you for that question. And I'll definitely answer your question, at least from what's happening here in Franklin County, and also answering the question that came from the audience. One of the things that we've done, rather than necessarily looking at the capacity of the court and whether to mitigate that, is creating a pigeonhole effect where, one, we're trying to, again, go more upstream and divert people from ever landing in the court in the first place. And then on the back end, as we are a community that right now, we are the only jurisdiction in the country that has shut down a jail to then demolish it and then build an early learning center. That's how deep that we're going in our efforts to say that preschool to prison pipeline that we've talked about for so many decades, we have to intentionally and actively eradicate it by taking away physical structures, physical capacity. And even as we have a new jail that's online, we are still capped at how many beds we're willing to build. Franklin County is the largest county in the state of Ohio. It is made up of about upwards of 1.3 million people and counting. And our growth and what's anticipated in the next 10 to 15 years is astronomical, right? However, we do not want to build to that capacity or put people into a criminalized situation based on that capacity. We want to continue to move the needle in not having to criminalize people in order to help them, creating alternatives to our detention, creating alternative to our courts, and even within the auspice of the court process, what are some of those alternatives that they can embed within their own practices to ensure that these things are not, again, a burden rather than the pathway forward for individuals to have a better quality of life. And so as we've tried to look through some of the things that, Dylan talked about, the fines and fees, our court and working with our municipal court, we did data on the amount of warrants that were outstanding, warrants that go back almost 10, 15, 20 years. If a warrant is that old, I promise you, it's probably not that deep. Like, it's probably not that necessary. And we're probably doing some there's some procedural injustice that's happening that we really, really need to take a look at. And so with our municipal court, we recently launched at the end of last year, our tap-in center, which is a warrant misdemeanor nonviolent warrant recall program that is in the community that meets our residents where they are to allow them to address their legal matters with dignity, with respect, and with a humanized approach to the things that are necessary for their next step to truly be the best step. And so we incorporated wraparound services in there, but our municipal court, our clerk's office, the Ohio Bureau of Motor Vehicles, license reinstatement, everything that a person would need that finds themselves in a situation like having that minor misdemeanor warrant that is nonviolent. We work to not only course correct, but again, walk with that person, because for us, it is not just about reentry, it's about true reintegration. Where are you at 2 years from now, 3 years from now, after I have given you what said services or supports you need? And if you're coming back to me in 6 months with the same thing I gave you 6 months ago, I didn't help you. I harmed you. Whether it was unintentional or not, I did not put you in a place where you could be better for it because of systematic barriers and systematic oppressive processes. And so here, same thing, Jonathan, we are very much a red state, but we are a very big blue county, right? So our commissioners have remained steadfast in their, racial equity as a core value. In 2020, we declared racism a public health crisis, because it is. We began to really say, this is who we are. And this is who we are because this is who our people, who they are. And we have to make sure that we continue from a legislative lane. The policy aspect of justice policy and programs focuses on that. What is happening on, on Capitol Hill, what's happening in our state house, where our elected officials, our appointed officials such as myself can be present to give testimony, to follow the policy mapping. We developed a whole entire policy team just to map policies and legislative changes, because we understood what that process is normally like, and it's not the most inclusive process, to be frank. And so those are some things that our county has just continued to push, understanding what the state umbrella is. We have a county umbrella that we have the ability to impact directly, and in a different way than what our state partners really can ascertain. And so we've just continued with that path forward.
If I could just interject before handing it over to Dylan to contribute any thoughts, just prompted by another question in the Q&A. Somebody had asked, what does abolition look like structurally? And I guess what I'm hearing from some of the answers that you all have given is, one, right, if we're actually talking about eliminating courts or making these big structural changes, you are likely going to require legislative action, which might be a problem, as Jonathan sort of described. On the other hand, right, as Rochelle was saying, there are certainly solutions that you can do to shrink the footprint, which is right, creating interventions upstream, creating diversionary programs. And the one thing that I would just quickly add in response to Jonathan's question, having spent my life practicing in Georgia and still being based here in Georgia, which is also a red state, but seeing right some years of very successful criminal justice reform, I think sort of looking where there is alignment, right, on issues that right, are maybe not specifically aimed at racial or economic disparity, but where changing certain policies is obviously going to have an effect, right, on those disproportionate impacts. So I think finding areas of alignment, whether it's around cost or right, other sort of neutral seeming objectives, I think you can often I'm not the expert in this, but just seeing some of the wins that I think folks involved in those fights were able to get in Georgia, I think it was trying to find those areas where you could get people to agree that maybe were framed differently, even though they would ultimately have the same impact. But Dylan, I
And
will
Lauren,
let you, go ahead.
okay, that's something we're doing. The other thing that we're doing with that is using as much constitutional language as possible in our efforts. Because if we feel if we use that, if someone attacks that, well, they're attacking, the Constitution. So along with alignment, that's the other thing that we're trying to do is clothe all of our efforts in constitutional language for protection and sort of.
Sorry, I'll just add a couple quick thoughts. First, to echo everything Lauren said, I think one of the greatest frustrations or challenges of fine and fees generally as an issue is also the greatest opportunity for reform. The way fines and fees are implemented and collected and the effect that has touches every part of the system in a pretty corrosive way. So there's actually, I'll go back to the Ferguson report. There's a lot of this sort of stuff in there, but there's this quote from an email, I guess, that was sent from a finance director to the city manager. And he says, the finance director says, court fees are anticipated to rise about 7.5%. I asked the chief of police if he thought he could deliver a 10% increase. He said he would try. Do you really, in your heart of hearts, believe that the chief of police wants that to be his job for the next year? Right? Do you think that that's what cops wanted to do when they were dreaming of being cops when they were young kids, is being armed debt collectors, right, and going around the community and basically knocking down doors to raise money for the city? And I say all that to say, Jonathan, to your question, for us, we always try to come at this work from a very human-centered, community-centered perspective, right? Fines and fees, municipal courts, this type of stuff has a detrimentally, a hugely devastating impact on people's lives. But there's also, if that is not compelling for you, or if you're sort of, you have different sort of goals as a legislator or policymaker, or politically speaking, whatever, there's also arguments around system efficacy. Across the country, you are spending more than you are ever collecting when you're relying on fines and fees for revenue. And so to the extent that municipal courts are sort of perpetuating that, the state's probably losing more than it's ever bringing back. And so if the idea is like, we actually want to consolidate things and make things more effective, yeah, we could definitely talk about that. And I think we should talk about that from the positive impact it could have on people's lives. But from a systems perspective, from a state budget perspective, it's just not an effective way to do things the way you're doing them now, right? For police, like, get law enforcement where you can, find law enforcement partners. We try to find law enforcement partners to testify on the fact that this is not how they want to be in relationship with community. So, even if you don't agree with us that there are sort of moral, values-based, sort of human-centered reasons to sort of do these refinements and reforms, if you're a law enforcement champion as a state legislator, you're putting your law enforcement in a really bad spot by forcing them to go do this every day. And so I know that's like a very sort of simple broad strokes answer, but it does, I think, Lauren, I want to echo kind of everything you said, that there are so many different angles to this. And it's one of the issues, it's probably the only issue that I know of in my career in criminal justice reform that really touches every part of the system and just corrodes it and erodes the trust that folks can build with one another and with community. And so I think for any legislator, and I'm not naive to the fact that, yes, you're never going to win every heart and mind. Of course, if this were easy, we would have done it. We would have already ended fines and fees and all the problems. I'm not telling you it's easy to do this, but I do firmly believe that regardless of a legislator's political beliefs or sort of predisposition on this stuff, there is an inroad to this conversation, because fines and fees and municipal courts and the way it's all connected is touching something that person cares about in a really unhelpful way. And I think it's just a case in a lot of states of finding what that sort of inroad is for that particular person. But there really isn't any part of the system that's left immune from the damage of this.
So we only have about 4 minutes left. I feel like we've just scratched the surface, but let me try to do this. So I'm going to try to sort of generalize the other questions in the Q&A and offer that as a question that I'll pose to Dylan. And then I have another sort of general question that I'm just going to also pose now. I'm hoping that maybe Jonathan and Rochelle can just chime in really quickly. So there are some questions in the Q&A that sort of relate to the fact that obviously fines and fees are imposed on people who just can't pay them, right? Or this seems like this intractable problem. And somebody had asked about what is the potential of litigation in this area, or right, just trying to change the law. So again, it's a really big question, Dylan. I'm wondering if you could chime in, but maybe also refer them to. I'm sure that I know that the Fines and Fees Justice Center has information on that, so maybe you could also direct people. The other question that I wanted to touch on at some point, just because I'm sure we have people in the audience, right, who are working in municipal courts around the country, and Jonathan and Rochelle have made such. I know a lot of these efforts are in progress, but you've made such big strides, right? Or you've gotten a lot of buy-in institutionally, and it seems like, and made really interesting connections with researchers. And so I guess I'm just curious if there's any sort of quick tip or advice you can give to folks who may be working in a municipal court who at least who are right don't have that right now. What might you advise them as to how they can sort of build capacity, get buy-in, or reach out to folks that they might be able to partner with? So let me let you guys think about that, and I'll have Dylan try to quickly address the first question.
Yeah, super quick. Yes, there's obviously a lot of opportunities to push back on the challenge that fines and fees present. I would just say, for purposes of time, fines and fees, justicecenter.org. We have an amazing clearinghouse full of incredible resources, policy, research, advocacy, legal. So please check it out. And I'm sure that you can find at least the start of what you need in that clearinghouse. But obviously, you know, my contact information, we can share it. I think it's on the website. Just reach out anytime, because I really would love to talk to you. I'll just say quickly, though, I want to also lift up how that question captures one of the great contradictions of this, which is you are attempting to extract resources. I won't even say wealth, resources from people who do not have it to give. And then when they can't do it, when they can't give you the resources they don't have, they get punished, they get harmed. Your system, Jonathan, to your question and to your point, loses the budget, the revenue it needs. You're now in a position, Jonathan, like you said, of having your court be the face of a lack of trust and a lack of credibility and integrity. And so I just want to sort of lift that up as part of the question. It is, when you step back and think about it, a little bit wild that we're in the position we're in. It has been decades in the making to get here. It'll be decades to get out, but we shouldn't lose in some ways the simplicity of this. What we're doing just doesn't make sense. And the need for reform is really clear. But yes, if folks want to learn more about how we're thinking about those reforms on a number of different avenues, just definitely check out our website, please.
Okay, so we only have a minute left, but I'm going to hopefully, maybe they can give us an extra minute or two. So maybe just 1 minute each for the other two panelists to chime in anything that they would like to add.
I'll be super quick. I'll say leadership is key. Leadership is really key. So if you don't know where they're at, do an inventory. We'll talk to them, engage them, and see where they're at, because this goes nowhere without leadership. So engage your leadership, and inventory them. And then real quick, this is a really righteous cause, so don't lose hope. Look for partners, look for allies, and you know, right now it's kind of a crazy time, but lean in, because this is, again, a great work.
Yes. Thank you. I echo everything that Dylan and Jonathan stated. I would say identify your champions, right? Identify the people that understand. I think to what Dylan just said is really the simplicity of what we're talking about, rather than the challenges of what we're talking about, and how we can arrive at a common thread. And so utilize them to convene, utilize them to align on those common goals, and understand that the common ground should always be the same. We are trying to eradicate structural determinants of health, life, and death that have impacted social determinants of health for individuals who find themselves impacted by the justice system. Fines and fees are another way to, unfortunately, exacerbate poverty, exacerbate people who we understand are impoverished, and we almost make them prove that to us as if we don't already know that's the truth. And so I say emphatically, convene, collaborate, coordinate. You cannot do it alone, and a collective impact approach is going to be the greatest path forward and yield the most progress.
Well, thank you again to all of our panelists. I really wish we had more time to learn from all of you, but thank you for taking the time to join us and share your knowledge with us. I just want to remind those in the audience that this webinar series is not over. There are several more opportunities. Hopefully you've gotten the email or you saw them in the email, but our next webinar will be on May 29th at 12 noon Eastern, focused on best practices for court practitioners. So thanks again to everyone, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.